Somebody remind me of who a split brain patient is. Because why can't the two sides of the brain connect? Well, they could connect because of a corpus callosum. But a split brain patient has had... That's the corpus callosum. And they haven't had a stroke necessarily. They've had epilepsy. And remember, the two hemispheres communicate through the corpus callosum. And because the seizures can travel through that body, if they have epilepsy that is really uncontrollable through any other way, occasionally surgeons will go in and cut that bundle of fibers. Does this sound familiar? It should. All right. So I want you to take a minute and think about lateralization. We were talking about right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And to the degree which they're specialized, and remember we decided that they worked in concert with one another, what is going on in the right hemisphere that's different than the left? What's the right hemisphere good at? Very good. Did you just look that up? Spatial relationships. What else? Emotional content, right. And what else did you say over here? Not so much. I mean, memory's over there, but it's not a difference between the hemispheres. The left hemisphere is good at what? How so? So definitions, structure of language. And so together we say this is language. Even though, so when we say the left hemisphere is good at language, that's taking into account that it's not good at the emotional contents of language. And the example I gave last week was if your left hemisphere is talking to your girlfriend and she says everything's fine, the left hemisphere goes, cool, what's next? If the right hemisphere is not engaged, the right hemisphere is going, whoa, 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 stop. It's not fine. It's not fine at all. So that's what's going on in the left. And I also gave you the example if you're doing a haiku, the left hemisphere would be very good about the structure of the haiku, saying it's got to have this many syllables, and this many lines. And then the right hemisphere has to be working in conjunction with it to get the haiku to work out right. So if we sever the right and left hemisphere, what do we get? All right, so this diagram is in your book, and we are going to work our way through. It's worth understanding what you're looking at here. So there's a right visual field and a left visual field out there, and there's kind of split pretty much down the middle, but there's a little bit of overlap, and that's why you see what looks like overlap area here. The way things work in our perceptual systems, everything over in the right hemisphere ends up on the left side of the eyeballs. So right visual field ends up in the left half of the eyeball. The right half of the eyeball sees the left visual field. Does everybody remember this? Now, what happens is the signals are picked up here at the retinas, as you well remember. And because of this idea of the labeled line, we're not sharing neurons to do multiple senses here at all, or multiple signals. When the optic nerves get back to the optic chiasm, what's really interesting is everything gets crossed over. So all of the signals, which are represented by the blue lines here, end up in the left hemisphere. So all the right visual field is going to end up in the left hemisphere. All the left visual field is going to end up where? Your geniuses. And you're going to end up back here. There's thalamic processing, and then these projections come back to primary visual cortex. Now, you would go, why is it that we don't have this weird perception of the world? Well, the reason that you don't have a weird perception of the world is because you have a corpus callosum intact. And these two hemispheres can talk to each other about what they're seeing. They can share information. However, if you are unfortunate enough to need split brain surgery, these signals still go to opposite sides of the brain, but you can no longer have your hemispheres talking to each other. So what happens? Well, let's look at what happens here in the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere, sorry about that, is going to see stuff in the right visual field. And so if you said, what are you seeing, left hemisphere? What's it going to say? It's going to say a fork. Why? Because that's where language, in terms of being able to define things, lives. If you ask the right hemisphere, what do you see? What's it going to say? But it can pick out the right object. Why? And right hemisphere controls the left hand. So spatial relations is right, but we need to follow it through. So this is all really interesting. Now, you will only see this under laboratory conditions, and the reason is sometimes the people with these surgeries are really good at compensating. They've learned little tricks. Like they'll have the other hand point to the right thing when it can't name it. Or move the hand over. Sometimes it'll do stuff like that. But sometimes it gets really fascinating. And this is where the split brain patients really have a lot to tell us about what's going on. Again, this is an experiment right out of your book. So in this experiment, split brain patients are asked to look at this screen and to foveate on this black spot. Foveate means to focus on it. So the right hemisphere is going to see a snow scene. The left hemisphere is going to see a chicken foot. If you ask the left hemisphere what it sees, it'll say chicken foot. If you ask the right hemisphere, it's going to say, I don't know. I don't know what's there. But now here's what's real interesting. If you then have them look down, you show them this array of cards that we have right here, and say, pick out the objects that are most like the ones you were just looking at, they will always pick out the chicken foot without a problem, and they will always pick the snow shovel without problem. And so you say, well, why did you pick those? And they go, oh, that's very easy. the chicken goes with the chicken foot, and you need a shovel to clean up after the chickens. And those are some mighty big chickens if you need a snow shovel, because snow shovels are very wide, very big. That's fascinating. And this brings us back, and your book talks about this a lot, in part because it's very fascinating, in part because he's one of the guys who's really, the author of your text is one of the people who've really pushed this idea. And we have talked about this very idea before, the interpreter. The interpreter is that left hemisphere function that's trying to explain why things are going on. The better its facts, the more plausible story it's going to tell you. The worse facts it has at its command, the poorer story it's going to tell you. It's very good at saying the chicken foot goes with the chicken, but it doesn't have awareness of having ever seen the snow. It knew enough about the meaning that the shovel was the one that matched best, but it had to make up a story about what the shovel was doing. Again, we see this in a lot of scenarios in psychology. Reconstructive memory is one of them, and it turns out to be poorly named because it's not really memory when you're reconstructing, at least in the recovered memory sense. And we see it with Korsakoff syndrome. Somebody remind me what Korsakoff's is. Bow, 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 bow. Somebody, Korsakoff's, something you would get from... I'm wondering if you guys have acquired this over the weekend. Did you guys all eat while you were out drinking? Korsakoff's is the loss of brain tissue from alcoholism. Remember, they don't get enough thymine, and their brains literally shrink up. And what happens is the alcoholics become liars. They make up these weird stories. And now, confabulation, the term for this, is often called honest lying. Because it's not that these people are setting out just to tell whoppers. They're not trying to run a scam on you. It's just they have so few facts available to them that they make sense of the ones that they have awareness of, and the stories just become less and less plausible over time. So the left hemisphere confabulates. It's trying to interpret what's going on in the world. Now, another thing that is related to this, Wolford and his group in 2000, again, this is a study that we referred to before, do a great experiment where they do this, and they do this with non-human subjects and human subjects both. And what they'll do is they'll flash up either a red or a green screen in front of you. And your job is, from trial to trial, to guess what color is going to come next. Is it going to be red or is it going to be green? Now, unbeknownst to you, there's a pattern. 70% of the time, it's going to be red. 30% of the time, it's going to be green, or vice versa. But there's 70% of the time, it's going to be one color, 30% the other. Rats, mind you, those unconscious little critters, do very good at this. Virtually every species except humans do very good at this. But oh, not us, not with our left hemisphere and our little interpreter. Little interpreter's looking for patterns. Little interpreter's telling a story. Little interpreter's going, oh, it must be that it's going to be green this time because the lights flicker before it's green. I've noticed that. Or these really weird ideas that we develop about things that detect patterns. Now, pattern detection serves us well, but we find patterns even when there's not. And I could show you slides of things that you go, aha, a face on Mars. That's our pattern detectors. You know, Jesus in the bark, right? You'll see like people go and say, oh, there's this bark pattern, it's Jesus. Or you go to parks and they see camels and rocks. You know, Mother Teresa and the grilled cheese. And I'm not making up any of these. We are hardwired to look for patterns. And our interpreter is out there looking for them. Now, here's another fascinating little outcome. Most of us, if we're put in this study, would only get about 58% of the trials correct. That's pretty bad, considering 3/4 of them are going to be one color or the other. We should be able to figure that we can. If we put a split brain patient into that situation, they will do as well as non-humans. So if we put a split brain patient into this scenario and present it to the right hemisphere, we do perfectly fine. So it's a case where our thought patterns get us in trouble. All right, I'm going to leave us here today. Special thanks for our shoe tying team there.